Hi, I'm David. Welcome to A Tale. Once a week on this channel, we tell a true story from history, the kind I stay up too late reading about, told slow enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, it is the story of the 47 Ronin of Japan, 47 masterless samurai who kept one promise across almost 2 years, through a great deal of patience and one quiet snowy night. Everything you will hear really happened, and the sources are listed below. There are no ads waiting to wake you, and I will tell you right now that this story ends in peace, with all 47 of them at rest beside their Lord, honored ever since. So settle in, get warm, and let an old story keep you company. Good night. Close your eyes now, if you like. This is a story, and stories ask nothing of you, except that you lie still and let them happen. And before we begin it, let me give you the ending, so that you can hold it the whole way through, the way you hold a warm cup with both hands on a cold night. There are 47 men in this story, and every one of them keeps faith. That is the whole of it, told at the start, so that nothing ahead can worry you. A lord loses his life and his lands in a single afternoon for a thing done inside a great castle, and his samurai are left with no master, which in their world was to be left with no place at all. Most of them scatter quietly into ordinary lives, but 47 do not forget, led by a calm and careful older man named Oishi Kuranosuke. They wait for almost 2 years. He lets the world believe he has fallen into idleness and wine and given up, so that no one will watch them too closely, and it costs him a great deal to wear that mask, and he wears it anyway. Then, on a night of heavy snow, near the end of the year, they gather and go, together, and finish the thing they came to finish, gently and without cruelty, and carry the result of it across the sleeping city to their Lord's grave, and lay it there. And then, having done what they set out to do, they give themselves up, all of them, and wait to be told how they must die. They are told to die by their own hand, which in that time and place was the honorable death, the one reserved for men of their standing, a grave and dignified end, and not a shameful one. And so they die on the same day in good order, and are carried to the same temple where their Lord already lay, a quiet place called Sengakuji, and buried there in a row beside him, so that the master is not alone. And the people of Japan decide almost at once that these were the finest men of their age, and have gone on deciding it for 300 years. The graves are still there, swept and tended every day. The incense smoke has not really stopped rising in all that time, so nothing that happens in this story can go wrong in the end, because the end is rest and honor and a row of quiet graves that the whole country still keeps. You know the harbor now. Let the ship take its time. To understand why this story mattered so much, you have to understand the strange and lucky time it happened in, because the time is half the story. Japan in the year 1700 was at peace, deeply, thoroughly, almost boringly at peace, and had been for the better part of 100 years. That was not the natural state of things, and everyone alive remembered from their grandparents that it had not always been so. For centuries before, the country had torn itself apart in war after war, great lords against great lords, castles burning, the roads unsafe. Then, at the very start of the 1600s, one family, the Tokugawa, had finished the last of the great wars, taken the title of shogun, the supreme military ruler under the distant and mostly ceremonial emperor, and clamped down on the whole country, a peace so firm that it held for more than 250 years. They kept it by arranging everything, The Tokugawa shoguns ruled from a growing city in the east called Edo, which we now call Tokyo, and bound the great lords of the land, the daimyo, into a careful web of duties. Each daimyo governed his own province, his own castle, his own band of samurai warriors sworn to him, but each also had to spend part of every year attending on the shogun in Edo, and to leave his family there the rest of the time, more or less as gentle hostages, so that no lord could rebel from far away without abandoning his own wife and children. It was built by men who had seen war and never wanted to see it again, and it worked. And it left the samurai, a whole class of men, bred and raised for war, with almost no war to fight. Sit with that, because it is quietly one of the sadder facts in this whole story. The samurai were warriors, as their fathers had been, back through the centuries of fighting. They wore 2 swords as the badge of their class and lived by a code of honor and loyalty forged in real battles. That code had a name, Bushido, the way of the warrior, and its heart was faithfulness. A samurai belonged to his lord, the way your own hand belongs to you, and his whole worth was measured by his loyalty. Yet by 1700, most had never drawn a sword in anger, and never would. They had become, in the long peace, something more like officials, who kept the accounts and managed the rice that was the true wealth of the land. It was a good life, a settled life, and a slightly haunted one, because they all carried inside them a code meant for a test the peace had quietly taken away. They knew what they were supposed to be, and rarely got to find out whether they truly were it. This particular stretch of the long peace even had its own name, the Genroku era, remembered as a kind of golden autumn of old Japan, a time of ease and art and pleasure, the cities rich, the theaters full, the merchant class growing wealthy and fond of beautiful things, which is exactly the time when a story about hard old loyalty would strike people most deeply, because it reminded them of something they were half afraid they had lost. Into that soft golden age, one spring morning, comes the small hard thing that starts everything. Our Lord was a young man named Asano Naganori, the daimyo of a domain called Ako, a modest but respectable holding on the shore of Japan's inland sea. Ako was known for its salt, for its castle, and for a body of samurai reckoned steady and well-ordered. Asano was in his early 30s, and by every account a decent enough lord, a little quick in his feelings perhaps, a little proud, but nothing anyone had ever thought a fault. If this one spring had gone differently, history would never have learned his name at all. In the early part of 1701, Asano was given an honor and a duty, which in that world were often the same thing. The imperial court, the old and revered but largely powerless court of the emperor away in Kyoto, sent envoys to Edo each year to exchange formal greetings with the shogun, and receiving them was a matter of enormous ceremony, where the smallest error would stain the shogun's own dignity. Asano was appointed one of the lords responsible for attending these envoys, a mark of the shogun's trust, and also a task in which he knew almost nothing and would have to be taught. The man appointed to teach him was a senior official of the shogun's court named Kira Yoshinaka, older, experienced, a master of exactly this world of protocol and ceremony, the keeper of how things were properly done. And so for a season, the young provincial lord had to go, again and again, to be shown how to carry out the honor he had been given. Now here the story reaches its one great mystery. And I want to be honest with you about it. We do not actually know what went wrong between these two men. We know only the result. The popular tellings, the ones the theater made famous, fill in the gap with a satisfying explanation. In those, Kira was greedy and corrupt and expected rich gifts from the lords he instructed, and Asano, honest and unbending, refused to grease the old official's palm. And so Kira, insulted, needled his pride day after day until the younger man broke. That is a wonderful story, and it may even hold some truth, but the careful historians cannot prove any of it. The surviving documents tell us only that on one particular morning, something passed between the two men, some slight, some cutting word, some pressure we cannot now see, and that the younger man could not bear it. The morning was in the middle of spring, in a great corridor of Edo Castle, the shogun's own castle, on a day of high ceremony, with the envoy's visit at its climax. And in that corridor, in that place where above all places a samurai was bound to be perfectly composed, Asano lost his composure entirely. He drew a short sword and struck at Kira. I am going to keep this moment far away, because it is the one sharp moment in a story that is otherwise all patience, and it need not be sharp for us. Let me tell it plainly, as the records do. Asano struck twice. The first blow wounded the older man on the brow, not fatally, more the harm of a sudden furious blow than of a trained killing stroke, and the second missed and bit into a pillar, and men rushed in at once and pulled him back, and it was over in a few heartbeats, and Kira was alive and would recover. As they took hold of him, Asano is said to have cried out that he had a grievance, that he struck for a reason, though he never said clearly what it was. That silence is part of why we cannot know. He took it with him. Now understand what he had done in the eyes of that world. It was not chiefly that he had wounded a man. It was where that castle was the still center of the whole piece, the one place that had to be untouchable, and to draw a blade there on a day of high ceremony in front of the emperor's own envoys was to strike at the dignity of the shogun himself. Asano had, in a few seconds of fury, broken the one rule the whole system was built to protect. The shogun of that time was a man named Tsunayoshi, stern, particular about ceremony and law, easily angered by any affront to the dignity of his rule, which was precisely what had just been affronted. When the matter was brought to him that same day, he did not wait and did not investigate the quarrel or ask what Kira might have said or done. The question was not the quarrel. It was that a lord had drawn steel in his castle, and the answer, in the shogun's mind, could only be one answer. Asano was ordered to die that same day by seppuku. We should stop here a moment, gently, and say plainly what that word means, because it will return at the very end, and you should have it settled in your mind now, so that when it comes back, it comes softly. Seppuku was the honorable death of the samurai class, a death by one's own hand, carried out with great composure according to a careful ritual, in the presence of witnesses, usually with a trusted companion standing by to make the end quick and merciful. It was grave and dignified, and above all, it was not a punishment of shame. To be permitted, it was to be treated as a man of honor to the last, given the chance to die as a samurai, and not be executed like a common criminal, with one's name kept clean. I will not describe it any more closely than that. What you need to carry forward is only that it was a solemn and dignified end, and being granted it was a mark of standing. So Asano was given that end. He was taken to the garden of another lord's mansion in Edo, where such things were properly done, and there, that same spring day, composed again now entirely himself, the young lord of Akko wrote a short farewell poem, as was the custom, a few lines about blossoms falling in the spring wind before they were ready, and then he died, quietly and with dignity. He was 33 years old, a daimyo in the morning, and gone by the evening of the same day. And here is where the story truly begins, because the shogun's judgment did not end with Asano. When a lord died in disgrace, in that system, his whole house could be dissolved, his domain taken back by the shogun, and his samurai released from service, which sounds mild and was not. It was the undoing of an entire small world, and that is what was decreed for Akko. Because Asano had died in disgrace and left no heir allowed to inherit, the house of Asano was declared at an end, and the domain, the salt, and the fields, and the harbor, and the castle, all of it was forfeit. And the several hundred samurai who had served the Asano family, some for their whole lives and their fathers' lives before them, were, in an afternoon, made masterless. There is a word for a masterless samurai, and it is the word at the heart of the story, a Ronin. It is an old word, and its root meaning is something like a wave man, a man adrift, tossed on the water without an anchor. A samurai's entire identity, his income, his rank, his place in the ordered world, all of it came from his lord. Take away the lord, and he kept his 2 swords and his training and his pride, and lost the one thing that gave all of that a shape. Some Ronin found new lords, if they were lucky and had a good name. Many did not, in that crowded, peaceful age when lords needed administrators more than warriors, and they slid, slowly, into poorer and quieter lives, their swords growing more ornamental every year. And so, on that spring day, several hundred good men of Akko became Ronin all at once, through no fault of their own. The news reached Akko by fast messenger, and fell on the domain like a winter with no warning. And the men of Akko had to decide what to do, and their first instinct was a hard and angry one, and it did not, in the end, win. It was to defy the shogun. When the officials came to take possession of Akko Castle, some of the samurai wanted to shut the gates and refuse to hand it over, and die there defending it, all of them together in protest. And you can feel why. Their lord was dead, while Kira, the man he had struck, was alive and unpunished, recovering comfortably in Edo. It seemed to them, and to many people since, that the judgment had fallen entirely on one side of a quarrel that had 2 sides, that Asano had at least been provoked while Kira walked away without so much as a reprimand. That sense of a scale, left unbalanced, is the engine of the whole rest of the story. Everything the 47 eventually did, they did to set that scale level again, in the only terms their world understood. But the man who now steps into the center of it did not, at first, want to die at the castle gate in a hopeless gesture. His name was Oishi Kuranosuke, and he was the senior retainer of the house of Asano, the chief of the Lord Samurai, the man who ran the domain's affairs under the Lord, roughly the way a chief minister runs a great household. He was in his 40s, and not, by the accounts we have, a famous swordsman or a fiery man or a natural leader of the loud kind. He was something rarer and far more useful, steady and patient, the sort of man who, in a room full of grief and rage, grows quieter rather than louder, and thinks, and waits and sees 3 moves further than everyone else at the table. When the terrible news came and the younger samurai were shouting about dying at the gate, it was Oishi who held them. He did not tell them their anger was wrong. He told them that anger spent all at once buys nothing, that to die defending the castle would change nothing and be forgotten in a season. And he turned their minds toward a slower path. First, he said, "Let us surrender the castle in good order as we are commanded, so that no one can say, 'The men of Akko were mere rebels.' And let us petition, respectfully, to have the house of Asano restored under Asano's younger brother, so that the domain might live again, and the men might have their places back." That was the honorable and hopeful road, and Oishi walked it first, fully and sincerely, and gave it every chance. And so Akko Castle was handed over calmly. The officials arrived, the gates were opened, and the salt in the fields passed to the shogun's men without a drop of blood, and the several hundred samurai of Akko scattered, most of them, into whatever lives they could find, while Oishi settled his own family and began the long, patient work of petitioning to bring the house of Asano back to life. It did not work. The petitions were considered, and in the end, refused. The house of Asano would not be restored, and with that, the last peaceful road closed, and Oishi and the men who still looked to him were left facing the one thing the peaceful road had been meant to avoid. Because there was, in the old code these men had been raised on, one more obligation, older and harder than any petition. A samurai owed his lord loyalty in life, but also, by the deepest teaching of that code, owed him something after death. If the lord had died wronged, a debt of honor a faithful retainer carried until it was settled. Asano had died with his grievance unanswered, and Kira, the other half of the quarrel, lived on untouched, and so the men who had truly loved Asano carried a debt. Now, I want to be very careful and very calm here, because this is the point where the modern heart and the old code do not fully meet, and it is better to look at that gap plainly than pretend it is not there. What Oishi and his men came to decide over that year was that the debt could only be settled one way, and that way was to go to Edo and take Kira's life, lay the fact of it before their dead lord, and so bring the scale level at last. It is not a promise you or I would make today, and the story does not ask us to. It asks only that we understand it from inside their world, where a warrior's whole worth was his faithfulness. From inside that world, what they were choosing was not cruelty. It was the most serious form of keeping faith they knew. And Oishi, having decided it, did the thing that turns this from a tale of revenge into a tale of patience, which is what it truly is. He decided that they would wait. He decided to wait for reasons that only a patient man would have given, and there were 3 of them. The first was simply that haste would fail. Kira, over in Edo, was no fool, and knew perfectly well that Asano's men might come for him, and in the months after the incident, his mansion was guarded and his household on alert, so any hasty attempt would have found the gates barred and very likely failed, and a failed attempt would have been worse than none, for it would have warned Kira forever and dishonored the men who tried. The way to succeed was to let the watchfulness fade until Kira relaxed and everyone in Edo decided the men of Akko had scattered and gone home. Patience here was not only a virtue, it was the weapon. The second reason was the men themselves. Oishi did not want a crowd of angry samurai. He wanted only the truest, the ones who would hold to the promise through a long dark waiting with no glory in it. And a long wait was the perfect sieve. Many who had first sworn to stand with him, and there were more than 47 at the start, would over the months fall away, pulled by poverty, by families, by the simple wearing down that time does to everyone. And Oishi let them fall away, without shame and without blame, for a man who could not hold the promise for 2 years was not one he wanted holding a lantern on the final night. By the end, the number had settled at 47, the ones left when everything easy had been taken away. And the third reason to wait was the hardest, and it fell most heavily on Oishi himself. To make the watchfulness fade, someone had to convince the world that the men of Akko had truly given up, and the person the world would be watching most was Oishi, the natural leader of any loyalty that remained. If he lived quietly and honorably, the shogun's watchers might reasonably suspect a dignified man was biding his time. But if he seemed to fall apart, to sink into idleness and drink and forget his duty, his loyalty curdled into self-pity and wine, then no one would fear him. A broken man is not a threat. So Oishi set out, deliberately, to appear to become one. He left the region of Akko and settled near Kyoto, and there he began to live, to all appearances, a dissolute and idle life. He was seen in the pleasure districts, seen drinking, and put aside in public the bearing of a serious samurai for the look of a man who had let his grief rot into indulgence. The stories that later grew up around this are very vivid, some surely embellished by the theater, of Oishi lying drunk in the street, while passers-by spat on him and cursed him as a disgrace to the samurai class. Whether every such scene is literally true, we cannot say. But the core of it the historians accept, that Oishi deliberately wore the mask of a fallen man, that it worked, and that it must have cost him more than the final night ever did. Think of what that mask cost. This was a man for whom honor was everything, raised from birth to believe his reputation was his soul made visible, and he chose, on purpose, to let it be dragged through the mud, to let strangers believe him a coward and a drunkard, while inside he held the promise as bright and hard as ever. He could not say, "I am only pretending. Wait, and you will see." He had simply to endure, being thought contemptible, day after day. Some telling say he even sent his own wife away and dissolved his marriage, so that when the end came, she and their children would not share the punishment, and there is real sorrow in that. The steady man made himself, in the eyes of everyone watching, into nothing, so that 47 quiet swords could one day be certain of finding the gate unguarded. Meanwhile, across the long months, the work went on beneath the mask, careful and unhurried. The Ronin who remained had scattered into ordinary trades all through Edo and beyond, and this too was part of the plan, for scattered men in humble work draw no attention. At least one, the accounts tell us, took work near Kira's own mansion and patiently came to know the layout of the great house, the habits of its household, and even, it is said, obtained a plan of the place. Little by little, without ever gathering in a way that could be noticed, they built up between them a complete and quiet knowledge of the thing they meant to do. They kept the promise warm among themselves in the dark, like a coal carried under the ashes so it will not go out. And the year turned and turned again, and in Edo, the memory of the Akko affair grew faint, the way even sharp things grow faint in a comfortable age. Kira, an old man now, relaxed his guard by degrees. The watcher stopped watching. the city decided the story was over, which is exactly what the steady man had been waiting for it to decide. It came in the deep cold near the very end of the year, in the 12th month, by the old Japanese calendar. By our own reckoning, the year had just tipped over into 1703, the very end of January, almost 2 years after the spring morning in the castle corridor. The waiting was over, because the waiting had done its work. Oishi had come quietly to Edo, and the scattered Ronin had drawn together, a few at a time, into a lodging in the city, careful even now, so as not to be seen assembling. And on the chosen night, in the small hours, they gathered in full and made themselves ready, and it was as if the year itself had dressed the scene for them, a night of heavy snow. I love that it was snowing, and I think the men themselves must have felt the fitness of it, because snow is the gentlest thing that falls from a winter sky. It muffled every footstep, and lay clean and white over the roofs and streets and walls of Edo, so that 47 men could move through the sleeping city almost without a sound. Snow keeps secrets and softens edges, and has a way of making even the most serious night feel hushed and set apart. They dress for the work in matching gear, so that in the dark and the falling snow, they would know one another and not, by mistake, strike a friend. And they carried something that tells you everything about the kind of men they were. They carried a written statement, signed by all of them, meant to be found and read afterward, so that no one would ever mistake this for a robbery or a private crime. In it they said, in the plain and formal language of their world, that they were the former retainers of Lord Asano of Akko, that they had carried this debt these 2 years, and now came to settle it as faithful retainers must, and were fully ready to answer to the law for what they did. They were not hiding. They were, in the truest sense, turning themselves in before they had even acted, laying their names and their reasons out in the open on the snow. Now the raid itself. I am going to keep the camera far away, up above the rooftops, among the falling snow, because the far view is the truer view of what these men intended. They did not want a massacre. They wanted one man and one thing settled, and they went about it with discipline, not with fury. So from up here, in the snow, this is what you would have seen. 47 figures dividing into 2 parties in the white and silent street before Kira's mansion, one to the front gate and one to the rear, according to a plan they had rehearsed 100 times. A signal given, softly, the 2 parties going in over the walls and through the gates at once, so that no one inside could escape to raise the wider alarm. Lantern light, small and moving, in the snow-filled courtyards, the household waking to find the thing already upon them. There was fighting, for Kira's men were samurai too, and defended their lord as they were bound to, and men on both sides were hurt, and some of Kira's household died defending him. And I will not take you closer than that, only tell you that it happened honorably on both sides, and was over before the city had fully woken. The Ronin took the house, and then searched it for the old man, and for a while could not find him. And there's a detail here that I find strangely tender in the middle of such a night. When at last they came upon an elderly man hidden in an outbuilding near the kitchens, they were not certain it was Kira, for none of them had seen him closely in years. But Kira, from the day of the castle, bore a scar on his brow, the mark of Asano's blow. And so, in the lantern light, in the snow, they checked gently and found the scar and knew him. And then Oishi did a thing that shows you the whole spirit in which these men had come. He did not fall on the old man in rage. He bowed to him, told him who they were and why they had come, and offered him, as one samurai to another, the chance to end his own life honorably by his own hand. He offered the enemy the honorable death. The old man would not or could not, and so the thing was done for him quickly, and I will leave it there in the snow at a distance and say only that it was finished without cruelty and without gloating, and that with it the debt these men had carried for 2 years was, in the terms of their world, at last paid. And then, having done what they came to do, the 47 did the thing that lifts the whole night out of mere violence and into the story Japan has never let go of. They put out the fires they had lit for light, carefully, so that no stray flame would spread to the neighbors' houses in the crowded city. They gathered their own wounded and accounted for every one of the 47. And then, in the gray beginning of the winter morning, with the snow still falling, they formed up and walked out of Kira's quiet ruined mansion and set off across the waking city, in good order, carrying the one thing they had come to Edo to obtain. It was a long walk across Edo to the temple where their lord was buried, and it was morning now, and the city was waking, and the snow was still coming down, and word of the strange procession ran ahead of them faster than they could walk. And this is one of the loveliest images in the whole story, and it really seems to have happened more or less as it is told. 47 tired men, some of them wounded, walking through the snowy streets in perfect order, silent, going somewhere with obvious purpose. And the people of Edo came out to watch them pass. They understood quickly what they were seeing, for the news of what had been done at Kira's mansion spread as fast as the men walked, and the ordinary people looked on these Ronin, not with fear, but with a kind of awe and even affection. Here were men who had done a hard and faithful thing, and were walking openly to answer for it, hiding nothing, running from nothing. It is said that people brought them warm food and drink along the way. In a soft and comfortable age that had half forgotten what such faithfulness looked like, here it was, walking down the street in the snow, and the city could not look away. The temple they were walking to was called Sengakuji, where Lord Asano had been laid to rest almost 2 years before. On that same spring day, he died, and to Sengakuji the 47 came, at last, through the temple gate, into the quiet grounds, out of the waking city, and into a stillness, and they went to their Lord's grave. And there they did the thing that the whole 2 years had been for. They laid the result of the night before their Lord at his grave as a report to him, the way you might lay an accomplished task before someone you had promised it to, not knowing whether you have been heard, and do it anyway, because faith does not require an answer to be faith. They burned incense at the grave, each in turn, Oishi first and then the others, in the cold, the smoke rising straight up into the snowy air. They told their dead lord that it was done, that his men had not forgotten him, that the debt was paid and he might rest. And in the telling of it, you can feel 2 years of held breath going out of 47 men at once, there in the snow, at the graveside. And then came the last piece of it, which they had known from the start. They had never meant to run. Having settled the debt to their lord, they now turned, of their own accord, gave themselves up to the shogun's officials, reported plainly what they had done, and waited, calmly, to learn their fate. And now the story does something you might not expect. It slows down, and becomes a story about a hard and thoughtful decision made by serious men who did not want to make it, and that decision is the reason the ending is as gentle as it is. The shogun's government had been placed by the 47 in a genuinely difficult position, and it is the hinge on which the honorable ending turns. On the one hand, what the 47 had done was plainly against the law. They had armed themselves, forced their way into a man's home, and killed him and several of his household, all without the government's sanction, in a state whose whole 200-year achievement was that men no longer settled their quarrels with private violence. This could not simply be waved away. If 47 men could take the law into their own hands, however noble their reasons, and be praised for it, then the peace itself was in question. On that ground, the law demanded that they die as criminals. But on the other hand, what they had done was, by the deepest values of the samurai class that the shogun himself embodied, close to the highest thing a samurai could do. They had been perfectly, unbendingly loyal to their dead lord, and had shown patience, discipline, restraint, and courage. They had harmed no innocent, taken nothing, and turned themselves in the moment their duty was done. They had lived out the old code of Bushido more completely than anyone had seen in generations. To execute such men as common criminals would be to insult the very virtue of loyalty on which the whole order of samurai and lords and shogun rested. On that ground, everything cried out to spare them, or at least to honor them, and so the government did not decide quickly. This time, unlike the swift judgment on Asano 2 springs before, the shogun and his counselors took their time, consulted scholars, and weighed the claim of the law against the claim of loyalty. And all the while, the 47 waited, held in honorable confinement, distributed among the mansions of several great lords. And here is a small, warm thing the records preserve. The lords who held them treated them not as prisoners, but almost as honored guests, with courtesy and respect, because they admired the 47 and knew exactly what they were looking at. Even awaiting a sentence of death, these men were being quietly told that what they had done had been understood and honored and would not be forgotten. The decision the government finally reached is, I think, a small masterpiece of wisdom, and it is the reason this story ends in dignity rather than shame. They decided that the 47 must die because the law could not be set aside and men could not be allowed to kill on their own authority, however just their cause. But they also decided that the 47 would be permitted to die by seppuku, by their own hand, the honorable death, the death of samurai, and not be executed like criminals. Sit with the grace of that softly. It said 2 true things at once. You broke the law, and the law must answer, and so you must die. But you are not criminals, you are samurai, and faithful ones, the most faithful of your age, and you will die as samurai die, with your names clean forever. Of all the ways that hard story could have ended, the men who ruled Japan found the one that let everyone keep what mattered most, the peace its protection, and the 47 their honor. And so we come to the end, the gentlest part of a story that has been building the whole way toward gentleness. It was early in the new year by our count, in the 2nd month of the year, 1703, only a little while after the snowy night. The sentence was given to the 47 and received calmly, even with something like relief, because it was the honorable ending they had hoped for, and the long 2 years of waiting and holding the promise were finally over. I told you at the very beginning that this part would be treated with all the gentleness it deserves, and there is almost nothing that needs to be described, and I will not describe it. What matters is the spirit of it, and it was calm. On the same day, in the gardens of the mansions where they were held, with witnesses present and every observance of ritual, the Ronin died the honorable death, each in his turn, with composure, as samurai of their age were trained from childhood to be able to do. 46 of them, to say it truly, for the youngest and lowest ranked of the band had been sent away as a messenger and was quietly spared and lived out a long life and was buried at Sengakuji beside his brothers at the end of it, so that the row of graves still holds all 47. It was solemn and dignified, and by the standards of their world, a good death, the clean end of faithful men. There is a quietness in the old accounts of it, the sense of something completed rather than broken. They were not afraid. They had settled everything they came to settle and went, in good order, into the stillness. And then they were carried to Sengakuji, to the same quiet grounds where their lord already lay. They were buried there, the 47, in a row, all together, near the grave of the Lord Asano they had served, so that in death they gathered around him one last time, the way retainers gather around their lord, and did not leave him alone. Oishi Kuranosuke, the steady man who had worn the mask of a fallen drunkard for 2 years, so that this could come to pass, was laid among them, one grave in the quiet row, his long patience finally at rest. And the people did not forget. That is the last thing, and it is the thing that turns this from a sad story into a story about how a country decides what it loves. Almost at once, the ordinary people of Japan took the 47 into their hearts and never let them go. Sengakuji became a place of pilgrimage within weeks and has been one ever since. So many people burning incense at the graves for so many years that the smoke has scarcely ever stopped. And the playwrights took the story and made it into the most beloved drama in all of Japanese theater and gave it a name, Chushingura, the treasury of loyal retainers, and dressed it in all the vivid embellishments we set gently to one side tonight. And it has been performed in one form or another for 300 years, so that there is scarcely a person in Japan who does not know the story of the 47 Ronin. But underneath the theater and the 3 centuries of retelling, the true thing is still there, and it is enough. 47 men who lost their lord through no fault of their own, and who chose, in an age that no longer required it of them, to keep faith with him anyway, and are remembered and honored and tended to this very day. You can still go and see them. That is the part I love, that the ending is not only in the past, but is also, quietly, right now, tonight, while you lie here. The graves are at Sengakuji still, in Tokyo, in a quiet corner of the enormous modern city, 47 small stones in a row near the grave of their lord, and people still come, every day, to keep them company. The world has rebuilt itself all around that little temple ground, and the stones are still swept, and the smoke still rises, and the 47 are still keeping their master company, patient as ever. History is good at keeping, when a whole people asks it kindly. So, let the story settle now, the way snow settles, the way a warm house settles, when the last light is put out. A young lord loses his composure for a few seconds on a spring morning, and loses everything, and dies with dignity by evening, and his men are cast adrift, made Ronin in an afternoon, through no fault of their own. Most drift away into ordinary lives, and no one would have blamed them, but 47 do not forget. The morning at the castle, the scale left unbalanced, the steady man who tries the peaceful way, first and fully, and only when every peaceful way is closed, sets his face toward the hard one. The long waiting, the mask of the broken man, worn 2 years, while the whole world spits on the name that had been his soul, the watchfulness fading, exactly as he knew it would, the night of snow that keeps their secret, the honorable end offered even to the enemy, the walk across the waking city while the whole of Edo comes out in awe, the incense at the grave and the quiet words, "It is finished," the turning of their own accord to give themselves up, hiding nothing, running from nothing, the wise judgment that lets the law be satisfied and their honor stay clean, and the quiet row of stones beside their Lord that a whole country has tended ever since. Keep the steady man somewhere in view, Oishi, drunk in the street on purpose, holding a bright hard promise inside a mask of shame, waiting, 2 years for 1 night of snow. Everything the whole story means is folded into his patience. He was not the fastest sword or the loudest voice. He was only the one who could hold a promise longer than anyone thought it could be held, and hold it quietly to the end. Your day is done too. Whatever it held, you kept faith with it, and it has carried you here to a warm bed at the quiet end of things, which is where even the hardest and most faithful story was always headed, toward rest. The snow is falling somewhere still, the way it always is somewhere. The fire is low, the house is safe. The 47 are at rest in their quiet row of stones, beside their Lord, with the incense rising, patient as ever, whenever you want the story again. Sleep now. Good night. History will keep till morning.